He's digging his own grave. The laughter carried farther than the north wind. Another man pointed at the strange pile growing beside an old wagon. No, he shook his head. He's building a weed coffin. Across the frozen prairie of Ashen Fork Flats, late October, 1887, Jasper Quillen, a widowed homesteader raising 2 children alone, never looked up. Another tumbleweed rolled past. He caught it before the wind could carry it away and brushed off the frost, then laid it carefully onto the wagon as though it were cut lumber instead of dead weeds. Behind him, Nell Quillen, his 12-year-old daughter, tied smaller tumbleweeds into neat bundles. Nearby, 7-year-old Tobin Quillen dragged another brittle bush across the frozen grass with a length of rope almost twice his height. The settlers along the county road simply watched. Wood was running short. Winter was almost here. Yet the poorest father in the valley was gathering weeds. Tobin stopped beside the wagon. "Pa." He looked at the growing pile. "Can dead weeds really keep us alive this winter?" Jasper rested another tumbleweed on top. He never answered. He simply walked after the next one the wind had not claimed yet. Only a year earlier, Jasper's family had moved to this area and owned enough to begin again. There had been a sturdy pair of mules, 6 healthy cattle, a decent harness, a proper wood stove, good tools that had taken years to collect. But then his wife, Eloin Quillen, fell ill during the spring. The sickness lingered through the summer heat. Every promise of recovery demanded another payment, another doctor, another wagon trip to a town farther away, another rented room for the night. One by one, they disappeared. To cover the costs, Jasper had to sell the livestock, the mules, and eventually the stove. When those were gone, he sold whatever still carried value. Nothing bought her another season. By the time the prairie grasses turned brown, Eloin was buried beneath a simple wooden marker, and the family owned little more than an aging wagon, an old bay horse, a handful of worn hand tools, and 2 children who still looked toward their father whenever something needed fixing. Jasper never spoke about what had been sold. He never spoke about what had failed. The only thing of Eloin's he refused to part with was a faded patchwork quilt she had mended so many times that almost every square carried a different stitch. As a bitter wind whipped across the wagon, Nell quietly lifted the folded quilt from the seat. She brushed away a few specks of dust, then placed it carefully deep inside an empty wooden crate where no frost could reach it. Jasper noticed. He said nothing. The house was unbuilt, their resources gone. A fragile quilt could not hold back a blizzard. They had to find another way to survive. There would be time to remember later. Winter was arriving first. Jasper paused out on the open prairie, his eyes falling on a tumbleweed that had caught against a patch of frozen bunchgrass. He bent down and picked it up, but instead of tossing it aside, he snapped one of its brittle branches in half. Hundreds of tiny spaces opened inside the tangled stems. For a moment, the prairie disappeared. Years earlier, when Jasper had been no older than Tobin, his father had led him across another treeless country where winter arrived long before the calendar said it should. One bitter night, they slept inside a rough shelter woven from brush, dry grass, and old hides. Before they settled down, his father had broken apart a bundle of dry stems and held it toward the firelight. "Anything that holds small pockets of air will hold a little warmth," he had said. "Stack enough of it together, and winter has to slow down." At the time, they had sounded like ordinary words. Only years later did they become a blueprint. Ashen Fork Flats offered very little timber. It offered wind, it offered grass, and it offered tumbleweeds by the thousands. Jasper looked at the broken branch in his hand before passing it to Nell. "Look closely." She turned it beneath the afternoon light. Tiny hollow spaces ran through every twisted stem. Tobin leaned in beside her, curious but silent. Jasper did not explain anything else. He simply reached for another tumbleweed. Sometimes an old lesson did not become useful until the land finally asked the right question, and in that very moment, The blueprint for a shelter made of weeds quietly took shape in his mind. Within days, the story spread along the county road faster than the autumn wind. Travelers slowed their wagons just long enough to stare at the growing mound beside Jasper Quillen's claim. One ranch hand laughed first. "Looks more like a rabbit pile than a house." Several others joined him. Then a louder voice rose above the rest. "It won't be a rabbit pile for long." The man pointed toward the tumbleweeds stacked beside the old wagon. "It'll be a weed coffin. First blizzard comes through, folks will be digging Jasper and those two youngsters out of that brush nest." The laughter rolled across the prairie. Jasper heard every word. So did Nell. Her hands paused for only a heartbeat before tightening another length of cord around a bundle of dry tumbleweeds. Tobin looked from the strangers to his sister, his small voice barely carried above the wind. "Nell, what's a coffin?" She did not answer. Instead, she stepped closer and rested one hand lightly against his shoulder, keeping him beside their father. Jasper never looked toward the road. He pulled another bundle into place, wrapped the cord twice, tied one careful knot, then reached for the next tumbleweed. The laughter faded into the wind. The work did not. Each afternoon, after the wind settled for an hour or two, Jasper turned the growing pile into a workshop instead of a heap. Nothing was sorted by chance. The largest, lightest tumbleweeds were stacked for the middle of the walls, where thousands of tiny air pockets could stay undisturbed. The tougher plants, with tighter branches, were set aside for the outer layer, where the prairie wind would strike first. Broken stems were spread beneath the wagon to dry before becoming kindling. The driest cores were tucked into canvas sacks and hung above the ground. Nothing rested directly on the frozen earth. Moisture belonged to the ground. Dryness belonged to the shelter. Nell used a small piece of charcoal to mark each pile on old crate boards. Wall. Outside, bedding. Dry firewood. Beside that stack, Jasper carefully arranged split willow sticks, dry cottonwood root pieces, curled strips of bark, and a few well-dried buffalo chips that would serve only as backup fuel. Tobin picked up one tumbleweed after another, holding each beside his ear before giving it a gentle shake. The dry ones answered with a crisp rattle. The damp ones stayed quiet. Jasper nodded. "Listen before you stack." Later, he lifted a canvas sack filled with dry firewood and handed it to Nell. "Remember this," he said quietly. "Anything that keeps warmth alive must stay dry first." Nell placed the sack on top of a wooden crate well above the ground. It was only a small pile of firewood. Before winter ended, it would become one of the most valuable things inside their home. The construction officially began. The land offered few heavy logs, and Jasper's design did not need them anyway. Instead, he walked the dry creek bed, cutting young cottonwood saplings no thicker than his wrist. Before bending them, he pressed their bases into wet creek mud for a day, letting the fresh wood soften just enough to curve without splitting. One by one, the saplings rose from the ground. They crossed overhead. Another followed. Then another. Soon the growing frame looked less like the walls of a cabin and more like the ribs of a great round skeleton resting on the prairie. Nell held each sapling steady, while Tobin hurried back and forth with bundles of fresh willow withes. Jasper tied every crossing point with careful, even tension. Nothing was hurried. Nothing was forced. The entrance was different from every cabin nearby. Instead of facing north toward the open prairie, Jasper dug a low tunnel facing southeast, where the bitter winter wind struck less often. Late that afternoon, Bramwell Cale, a local carpenter known for building square log cabins across the settlement, reined in his horse beside the claim. He studied the curved frame for several long moments. "There isn't a single corner," he finally said. "No sill. No proper chimney. That isn't a house." Jasper tightened another willow tie before answering. A square wall gives the wind a shoulder. Bramwell frowned. It needs a wall to stand against. It needs nothing to catch. Bramwell looked toward Nell. A little girl shouldn't be sleeping inside something without corners. Nell's hand stopped on the bundle of willow withes. Her eyes searched her father's face. Jasper never looked up. He simply pulled the knot snug, checked its tension with both hands, and reached for the next sapling. The curved frame continued to rise. So did the questions. One cold afternoon, Orson Vay, a neighboring settler who had recently finished a solid log cabin, rode across the prairie and stopped beside Jasper's claim. He looked at the woven dome, then at the children carrying tumbleweeds. "You've still got time," Orson said. "Ask around. Folks always have a few extra logs. Put up a proper lean-to before the snow comes." Before Jasper could answer, another wagon rolled to a stop. Harlan Soot, the settlement's firewood trader, climbed down with a faint smile that never reached his eyes. He picked up a dry tumbleweed and crushed part of it beneath his boot. "This stuff burns faster than dry straw," he said. "One spark, and your whole house goes up." He pointed toward the neatly stacked pile of split willow sticks beside the wagon. Then he laughed. "A man cannot warm children with sticks no thicker than his thumb." His eyes drifted toward the canvas sack marked dry firewood. "And if the snow changes direction, every piece of that wood will be soaked before you ever need it." Orson folded his arms. For the first time, he looked directly at Nell and Tobin instead of the shelter. "Jasper, don't let losing Aloan cloud your judgment. Those children need walls, not hope." The prairie fell quiet. Jasper rested another bundle of tumbleweed against the frame before speaking. "I don't plan to let a large fire touch these walls." He secured another willow tie. "And I don't plan to leave my firewood where winter can claim it." Nothing more. No argument. No raised voice. Only another knot pulled tight as the north wind swept across the open grass. By sunset, the visitors were gone. Only Mrs. Tamsin Rook, an elderly widow who had survived more winters than most people cared to count, remained. She walked slowly around the unfinished dome without speaking. Then she rested one weathered hand against the freshly tied tumbleweeds. The north wind swept across the curved wall. It never found an edge to grab. "Who taught you this?" she asked. Jasper looked at the woven branches. "My father," he said. "He taught me that you don't always need solid wood to stop the wind. Sometimes emptiness works just as well." Mrs. Tamsin nodded once. "Then your father understood winter better than most carpenters." She walked away without another word. Beside the frame, Nell watched the old woman disappear down the prairie trail. For the first time since the laughter had begun, she looked at the unfinished dome as though it might truly become a home. The first hard lesson arrived before the first snowstorm. A strong north wind swept across Ashen Fork Flats during the night, never changing direction, never losing strength. By sunrise, Jasper found part of the northern wall peeled away from the frame. Several lengths of binder twine had frayed until they finally snapped. A handful of tumbleweeds lay scattered across the frozen grass. Before Jasper could begin repairing them, 3 boys walking along the county road spotted the damage. One pointed toward the opening and laughed. "Look, the coffin's coming apart before anybody's even dead." The others laughed with him before disappearing down the road. Jasper never answered. Instead, he untied the damaged section himself. He spread the tumbleweeds across the ground instead of putting them back immediately. For several long minutes, he studied the broken stems. Every branch leaned the same way. Every snapped tie came from the same angle. The wind had not pushed straight through the wall. It had hooked the outer branches and pulled them loose. Nell knelt beside him with a piece of charcoal and marked the damaged section on one of her crate boards. Tobin quietly gathered every broken piece of twine he could find. Jasper turned each tumbleweed so the outer branches slanted with the prevailing wind instead of against it. Then he locked every layer together with fresh willow withes, crossing them diagonally before reinforcing the joints with narrow rawhide strips. The outer wall was packed firmly enough to stay together, not so tightly that it became stiff. It needed to bend a little, not break. Tobin stared at the frayed cord in his hand. Maybe they were right. Jasper took the broken length of twine and placed it gently back into the boy's palm. A broken tie tells where the wind was pulling. He looked toward the northern prairie. The wind didn't beat us. It showed us where to build better. The first night inside the unfinished igloo brought quiet, but not victory. Outside, the temperature fell to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, Nell checked the old thermometer before hanging it beside the entrance. 31. Warmer than the wagon. Not warm enough. By morning, Tobin climbed out from beneath the blankets and pressed one bare foot against the floor. He pulled it back immediately. It feels like stone. A moment later, Nell unfolded her mother's quilt. The lower edge felt cool, not frozen, just damp. Jasper ran his hand across the fabric. He already knew the answer. Warmth alone could not carry a family through winter. Trapped moisture would finish what cold had started. That same morning, the sleeping platform came apart. Jasper raised it another 14 inches with fresh cottonwood saplings and old crate slats. Beneath the prairie hay, he spread woven sedge mats to separate the bedding from the ground. A thin layer of fine wood ash followed, ready to pull away any moisture before it reached the blankets. Then he knelt beside the entrance tunnel and carved a shallow trench nearly 9 inches deep. Cold air was heavier, so was damp air. Both would settle into the trench instead of creeping toward the sleeping platform. By afternoon, Eloin's quilt hung across the curved sapling frame beneath a pale autumn sun. Jasper smoothed each corner with careful hands, making certain every stitch could dry completely before night returned. He lingered there for a moment longer than necessary. Then he quietly turned back to the shelter. Winter had found another weakness. Now it had one less. Jasper made one more trade before winter closed the roads. At the general store, he exchanged a good pocket knife for an old thermometer with a cracked glass tube. It was scarred, but it still told the truth. Every morning after that, Nell stepped outside first. She checked the temperature beyond the entrance tunnel. Then she came back inside and marked 4 numbers on the side of an old crate board with a piece of charcoal. Outside. Tunnel. Sleeping platform. Firewood hollow. The board slowly filled with dates instead of guesses. Night after night the numbers changed. After raising the bedding and rebuilding the north wall, the first deep freeze arrived. Outside, the thermometer settled at 6 below zero. Inside the igloo, the sleeping platform held at 39 degrees without a large fire. Later, with only a small lantern, 3 quiet bodies, and a pot of warm soup, the temperature climbed to 43. Tobin carried his mother's old tin cup to the entrance the next morning. The water inside still moved. It had not frozen. His grin appeared before he said a word. While Nell finished another line on the crate board, Jasper worked on something just as important. Inside the southern wall, he built a shallow firewood hollow above the ground. Split willow sticks rested beside dry cottonwood root pieces. Curled bark for kindling was stacked separately. A few well-dried buffalo chips waited behind them as emergency fuel. Nothing touched the outer wall. Nothing rested on the frozen ground. A canvas flap covered the opening while leaving enough space for dry air to circulate around every piece of wood. Each evening, Jasper checked the firewood with the back of his hand before closing the flap again. Heat could be made later. Dry firewood had to be protected first. His hand rested on Nell's crate board for a quiet moment. The numbers were beginning to tell the same story his father once had. A week later, Enoch Pruitt, the county claim clerk responsible for recording homestead improvements, arrived with a leather notebook tucked beneath one arm. He walked slowly around the igloo. No log walls, no stone foundation, no proper chimney, no square corners. He measured a few distances, wrote several notes, then closed the notebook. "I'm afraid this cannot be recorded as a qualifying settlement structure." The words settled harder than the cold. Behind Jasper, Nell lowered her eyes. Tobin quietly reached for his sister's hand. For a moment, Nell started to lift the old crate board covered with temperature readings. Jasper gently rested one hand across it. Not yet. Enoch looked at the woven walls once more. I measure structures, he said. This doesn't meet the standard. Jasper stood quietly beside the unfinished entrance tunnel. He showed no anger, no disappointment, only certainty. I wasn't building it to satisfy a ledger. His eyes drifted toward Nell and Tobin. I was building it to keep them breathing in January. Enoch held Jasper's gaze for a long moment. Then he walked back toward the county road. The crate board remained where it was. Its numbers would have to wait for someone willing to measure the right thing. Jasper never intended to heat the igloo with a roaring fire. The walls were built to keep warmth, not chase it. Still, a small brazier would be necessary. It could warm a pot of soup, dry wet gloves, or slowly burn a few buffalo chips during the bitterest nights. The first trial came on a calm evening. Jasper placed only a handful of glowing coals into the shallow iron brazier. For several minutes, everything seemed right. Then Nell looked up. A thin gray ribbon of smoke had begun collecting beneath the highest part of the dome. Not enough to panic, enough to matter. She coughed once. Across the shelter, Tobin rubbed his eyes. Jasper reacted before either child spoke again. He covered the coals with sand, lifted the brazier aside, pulled open the entrance curtain. Outside, the three of them stepped into the cold air and waited until every trace of smoke drifted away. The experiment was over. The lesson had begun. The next morning, Jasper climbed onto the dome and carefully cut a vent no larger than his closed fist near the rear slope, well away from the strongest northern wind. He carved a removable plug from bundled straw wrapped in worn canvas, then returned inside with the old lantern. The flame became his guide. If it leaned too sharply, too much warmth escaped. If it stood perfectly still, smoke lingered inside. Again, another adjustment. Again, a little more. By sunset, the lantern flame bent gently toward the vent, and the smoke slipped away without pulling the shelter's warmth with it. Jasper nodded once. The design had changed again, not because his first idea had failed, because his children mattered more than proving he had been right. By the first week of January, 1888, the prairie had changed. Not with snow, with silence. The north wind no longer came in restless bursts. It held one steady direction. Hour after hour, cattle turned their backs toward it without being driven. Frost hardened into a brittle crust that cracked sharply beneath every boot. Across the valley, smoke from Orson Vay's chimney no longer climbed into the sky. It was pressed flat against the horizon. Jasper watched without saying a word. Winter had begun asking its questions. He answered with work. A fresh mixture of clay slip and fine wood ash sealed every gap around the base of the igloo. He tightened each rawhide tie across the outer wall one last time before carrying more dry firewood into the southern hollow. The canvas flap fell back into place, protecting every stick from drifting snow. At the entrance, a second canvas curtain was hung behind the first, creating another pocket of still air inside the low tunnel. Nearby, Tobin tucked the last handful of dry kindling behind the firewood. Before sunset, Nell stepped outside with the cracked thermometer. She returned, wrote one final number on the crate board, and paused. Outside, 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Falling fast. Jasper laid a Lowen's quilt across the raised sleeping platform. His hand rested on the worn fabric for only a moment. Then he turned back toward the entrance. Winter did not argue. It simply measured everything. The blizzard did not arrive with snow. It arrived with sound. Before dawn, the north wind began crawling across the prairie like a distant freight train. By mid-morning, the steady roar swallowed every other noise. At noon, loose snow ripped free from the frozen ground and raced sideways across Ashen Fork Flats in long white sheets. Inside Orson Vay's log cabin, the fireplace burned hot enough to glow orange. The walls did not. Cold drafts slipped through the chinking between the logs, threading across the floor before climbing through the room. Leora Vay reached out and touched one corner of the cabin. She pulled her hand back at once. It felt like ice. Orson threw another heavy log into the fire, then another. The flames answered. The room barely did. Across the settlement, Harlan Soot fought a different battle. His woodyard held more cordwood than anyone else's, yet drifting snow had buried part of the stack. The outer logs were soaked before freezing into solid blocks. Men with axes hacked them loose, while fresh snow packed into every opening. Each trip outside cost more time. Each fire demanded more wood. The piles that had looked endless only days before began shrinking with alarming speed. Wood was disappearing like money spent too quickly. The fires were working harder than ever. The cabins were not. Leora watched another armload of logs vanish into the fireplace. She said nothing, but somewhere beyond the white wall of blowing snow, she found herself thinking about the strange little weed house standing alone on the prairie. Inside Jasper's igloo, the storm sounded different. The thick tumbleweed walls, now nearly 30 inches deep, softened the endless roar into a low, distant murmur. There was no roaring fireplace, only a small lantern, a carefully tended brazier, a pot of thin soup, 3 quiet people, and still air that refused to hurry away. Nell checked the cracked thermometer before writing another line on the crate board. Outside, -24 degrees Fahrenheit. Sleeping platform, 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Firewood hollow, dry. Tobin lifted one split willow stick from the southern storage pocket. It felt dry, not icy, not damp, nothing like the frozen wood stacked outside other homes. Nearby, Jasper adjusted the canvas-covered vent plug until the lantern flame leaned just enough to carry smoke away without pulling the warmth with it. Everything inside served a purpose. The raised bedding, the woven walls, the small brazier, the carefully protected firewood. There was no comfort to spare, only enough to survive. On the frontier, that was more valuable than luxury. Later that night, Tobin fell asleep without shivering. Jasper looked first at the sleeping boy, then at Alohan's quilt, still completely dry. Outside, the blizzard kept shouting. Inside, nothing answered. By the 5th day of the blizzard, nobody had seen a tall column of smoke rising from Jasper Quillen's claim. Through the frost-covered window of his cabin, Orson could barely make out a low gray mound almost swallowed by drifting snow. He must have run out of firewood, he said quietly. Harlan shook his head. That weed coffin's frozen solid by now. Even Enoch Pruitt, stranded at a nearby homestead, made a note that Jasper's claim might have been abandoned. Only Mrs. Tamsin Rook disagreed. She watched the distant dome through the blowing snow. If the wind still can't bury him, she said softly, perhaps it's still doing exactly what it was built to do. Leora lowered her eyes. What if those children are still in there? Orson looked toward the gray shape across the prairie. For the first time since the laughter had begun, he had no answer. The 6th night broke something besides the silence. Inside Orson Vay's cabin, one corner of the log wall twisted under the relentless pressure of the wind. Old chinking split apart. Fine snow burst through the opening like white smoke and scattered across the floor. Leora wrapped another blanket against the gap. The wind pushed it back. Their youngest child began shivering so hard that the bed frame rattled. Orson reached for another armload of firewood. There was almost none left inside. The rest was trapped beneath ice and drifting snow beyond the door. Nearly half a mile away, Jasper heard the sound through the storm. He knew it immediately. Wood under strain always carried the same voice. Without hesitation, he pulled on his heavy coat and wrapped a long rope around his waist. "Nell." She looked up. "Keep both canvas curtains closed unless you hear my voice." She nodded. No questions. Tobin hurried toward the entrance. "I can help." Jasper rested one hand on the boy's shoulder. "Not in this wind." Then he stepped into the whiteout. The rope disappeared behind him. The fence line appeared only a few posts at a time before vanishing again beneath the blowing snow. He followed the broken rhythm of the wind. And the memory of that cracking timber, there was no time left for pride, only time enough to reach another family before winter did. The trip back took twice as long. The wind tried to separate them with every step. Jasper led the way. Orson followed, one hand gripping the rope while the other held Leora's arm. She carried their shivering child beneath her coat as they crawled through the blowing snow toward the low gray dome almost hidden beneath the drifts. At last, Jasper pulled aside the outer canvas curtain. Then the second. Warm, still air met them before a single word was spoken. Orson stopped halfway through the entrance tunnel. He had expected bitter cold, wet bedding, smoke, darkness. Instead, the air inside was surprisingly warm. A small lantern glowed quietly beside a gently steaming pot of soup. The raised bedding showed no trace of frost or dampness. Glancing at the cracked thermometer that read 49 degrees, Orson's eyes fell upon the southern wall. The canvas flap was pushed aside, revealing a hollow still fully stocked with bone-dry firewood. No heavy logs, just carefully stacked twigs, roots, and dry bark. But it was enough to keep a family alive. Leora laid her child onto the bedding. Within minutes, the trembling slowed. Across the shelter, Tobin quietly picked up a dry willow stick from the firewood hollow and handed it to the little boy. Orson watched the simple gesture. Then he looked at Jasper. The words he should have spoken never came. They were still somewhere behind the shame in his throat. Morning returned with clear skies and bitter cold. The blizzard had finally spent itself. Enoch Pruitt came first, followed by Harlan Soot and another settler. They expected to find a collapsed shelter, or perhaps no one at all. Instead, the entrance tunnel remained open. Snow had drifted around the dome, not over it. One by one, they crawled inside. Silence greeted them before surprise did. 2 families. Still alive. Enoch's eyes moved slowly across the shelter, silently evaluating what had protected them from nature's wrath. Everything in this space was calculated. From the raised bedding that blocked moisture to the fuel supply safely shielded from the blizzard. Then his gaze stopped at Nell's crate board, filled with dates and numbers that recorded the shelter's astonishingly steady warmth. He reached out and pressed his fingers into the woven tumbleweed wall. They disappeared several inches before meeting the flexible frame beneath. Jasper quietly broke apart a dry tumbleweed stem. "It's not the branches keeping the cold out," he said softly. "It's the space trapped inside them. Nothing more." Enoch opened his notebook. He read the line he had written days before. Then he drew one careful stroke through it. Beneath it he wrote, "Emergency winter improvement. Functional shelter. Firewood storage remained dry after 6 days of storm." This time, Jasper did not stop Nell. She carried the crate board forward herself. For the first time, someone was measuring the same things she had been measuring all along. 8 days later, sunlight returned to Ashen Fork Flats, revealing nature's verdict. Snowdrifts buried the windward sides of square cabins, chimneys leaned, and outdoor woodpiles were frozen into solid blocks of ice. In contrast, across the prairie, Jasper's Tumbleweed Igloo looked plain. Low, gray, almost forgotten against the winter grass. Yet it still stood exactly where it had been built. Snow slid away from its rounded walls. No one called it a weed coffin anymore, not after the definitive answer that winter had just delivered. Bramwell Cale walked slowly to the curved wall. He removed one glove, rested his hand against the tumbleweeds, and stood there without speaking. Spring returned to Ashen Fork Flats, one slow day at a time. The snow retreated. The prairie breathed again. Not everyone suddenly wanted a tumbleweed igloo. Some settlers still called it a poor man's shelter. Others trusted nothing except heavy log walls. Winter had not changed every opinion. It had changed a few habits. That was enough. Orson Vay never rebuilt his home as a dome. Instead, he built a small tumbleweed shelter for his newborn calves, placing it where the north wind struck first. Leora carved a dry hollow beside her fireplace, keeping kindling off the floor and beneath a simple canvas cover. Silas Orr, a neighboring rancher, copied Jasper's layered tumbleweed walls to protect his chicken yard from drifting snow. Even Bramwell Cale quietly experimented with a rounded storage shelter, bending stronger ribs before weaving the outer layer. At the county office, Enoch Pruitt added a short note to future homestead records. Brush air shelters may serve as effective emergency winter structures when properly vented and kept dry. It was not praise, it was recognition. Jasper never advertised what he had built. He never charged anyone to see it. When neighbors asked, he showed them how to turn the outer tumbleweeds with the prevailing wind instead of against it. He showed them why bedding should never rest on frozen ground, why dry firewood belonged above the earth, and why a shelter had to protect heat long before it tried to make more of it. Only once did he repeat the lesson his own father had given him. Anything that holds small pockets of air will hold Chalti Sive. Tire. Chalti. Tompi. Tompi. Only once did he repeat the lesson his own father had given him. She shook the first beside Tobin's ear. It answered with a crisp, hollow rattle. The second stayed quiet. Wet, she said. Tobin smiled and reached for another. Jasper heard them from across the yard. He kept working without looking up. The lesson no longer belonged only to him. A spring wind rolled another tumbleweed across the prairie. Some people still kicked it aside. Others watched it a little longer before letting it pass. Because after one unforgettable winter at Ashen Fork Flats, a few had learned that wisdom did not always arrive looking valuable. Sometimes it arrived looking exactly like a dead weed.